With Ayaka expected to come next patch and Kazuha just around the corner, I wanted to take a bit of time and discuss Permafreeze Ayaka, specifically how to build a team around her. There are a few requirements that need to be met in order for Permafreeze to work, but once those are in place, there is still a lot of flexibility in terms of which exact characters you want to use for each role. I'll be trying to go over each character that you could potentially use in a Permafreeze setup, and then go over the pros and maybe cons of each of those characters. And to do that, let's first look at what a Permafreeze team needs in order to function. Most importantly, you'll need consistent application of both Hydro and Cryo in order to keep enemies frozen. Ayaka alone provides all the Cryo you'll ever need because she'll be able to maintain a Cryo infusion on her attacks without any downtime because it's bound to her dash ability that doesn't have any cooldown. For Hydro, you'll need a character that can apply Hydro consistently without having to be on the field. And at the core, these 2 slots are all you need to get Permafreeze Ayaka up and running, but for the remaining 2 slots it is highly recommended to add another Cryo unit in order to activate the Cryo Resonance and to help with funding Ayaka's high cost ultimate, and an additional support character that can further scale the team's damage. Now, in my opinion, you'd ideally want Anemo here because not only does Anemo not disrupt freeze, it also allows for damage amplification through the 4-piece Viridescent Venerous Resistance Shred. That's a mouthful. And depending on the specific character, it can also help with CC and other buffs. Zhongli or Bennett are exceptions that can also work because they're universally great supports, but only with certain limitations that we'll get into. In general, in a Permafreeze team, you do not want any supports that fling around elements that are not Hydro, Cryo, or Anemo, because all other elements will mess with maintaining freeze. And maintaining freeze is what lends this team its power, because it allows you to outsource a large part of your crit rate to the Cryo Resonance and the Blizzard Straya set. Okay, so let's try to go over each slot in this team. Slot 1 is obviously going to be Ayaka. She's going to be your main DPS and the unit that's on the field most of the time. She's going to have the Blizzard Straya set equipped for a huge power spike that relies on keeping your enemies frozen, or at the very least Cryo afflicted. For the Hydro slot, we can choose between Xingqiu, Mona, and Barbara. Xingqiu provides the most consistent Hydro application with his Hydro swords that spawn every second. He also deals a lot of damage and requires very little field time due to his long skill durations and cooldowns. He also reduces incoming damage, heals, and grants resistance to interruption. With Mona, you'll have a little bit of downtime in Hydro application due to cooldowns, but you're trading that for a lot more damage potential with her ultimate. As a mage, she can also wear the Thrilling Tales catalyst to boost Ayaka's attack, and she can taunt enemies with her E ability, which is also great. Overall, a great pick, especially since Xingqiu is already a must-have in so many other teams. Her biggest downside though is that she's not accessible to most. Barbara is the only other option we have until we get more Hydro characters. She applies Hydro with her healing aura that has a bit of downtime in between casts. The internal cooldown on her Hydro application is also longer than that of Xingqiu and Mona, so for the purposes of freezing enemies she'll do just fine, but permanently freezing could be difficult, so make sure you have enough crit rate on your Ayaka to not be entirely dependent on freeze. With Barbara you have to be very close to your enemies to apply Hydro, but that should not be a problem since Ayaka is a melee carry anyways. Beyond that, Barbara reduces stamina consumption on your active character, she can buff your attack with the Thrilling Tales catalyst, and she can be your dedicated healer at the same time. Plus she's free, so having her on the team will give you much more flexibility for your other 2 slots. Now let's get into the second Cryo character. This is your Ayaka Battery and Cryo Resonance Enabler. If you absolutely need another element instead to break shields in the Abyss or whatever, you can replace either this character or the other support slot we haven't talked about yet, because even though more burst uptime on Ayaka is always good, her Cryo Infusion is not dependent on energy whatsoever, so you don't actually ever run out of Cryo, if that makes sense. Anyways, we have quite a few options here, Chi-Chi probably being the worst for being energy hungry while not generating any particles herself and only healing, followed by Eula, since Permafreeze Ayaka isn't really meant to be a dual carry team. And even if you wanted to use Eula only for her resistance shred, that would require field time just to build up Grimheart stacks, which is time that you could spend on Ayaka instead. Rosaria can buff your crit rate even further, which may seem a bit irrelevant given that you're already getting up to 55% just from the standard Permafreeze setup, but if you somehow dodged every single crit rate roll on your substats, then however much crit Rosaria may provide could get you closer to whatever crit ratio you're aiming for. Keep in mind that Rosaria only shares a percentage of her sheet crit rate, so crit rate gained through 4-piece Blizzard Straya or the Cryo Resonance does not count, meaning you'd actually have to invest a lot of crit rate into your Rosaria to make her work well. Also, her constellations don't really add much to her as a support for Ayaka specifically, so if you don't actually need any further crit rate boosts, then there are better options than Rosaria in my opinion. Kaeya would be one of them. He doesn't provide any buffs, except the Cryo Shield with some constellations, but he's good at generating particles, and he adds a nice chunk of team damage with his ultimate, especially with constellations. So if you already have a healer and all other roles covered, and just want more damage, then Kaeya would be a great option. Chongyun is another surprisingly good option because even though his Cryo Infusion field seems redundant because of Ayaka's self-infusion, he brings a bunch of other utility to the table. He can boost the attack speed of Ayaka's normal attacks, he has an inbuilt Cryo Resistance Shred, his C2 allows for a cooldown reduction on elemental skills and bursts, and his own ultimate is low cost and on a 12-second cooldown, which makes him a great noblesse holder. Overall, he does less damage than a well-invested Kaeya with constellations, but his utility makes up for that. Then we have Diona. Diona is a great standalone unit already for being the only character in the game so far to combine both shielding and healing in one kit, and her being able to activate the Cryo Resonance makes her even better in an Ayaka team. With a Sacrificial or Favonius bow, she becomes a great energy generator as well. She won't deal any damage, but with her in the team you can dedicate your other 3 team members to do that job, while Diona keeps you alive. And then lastly we have Ganyu. Maybe she's wasted as a support and prefers to be a main DPS herself. That's up to you to decide, but we have to acknowledge that she has insane supportive capabilities, a 100% uptime ultimate, a taunt ability that keeps enemies grouped, and a buff to cryo damage for anyone inside her ultimate. Ayaka and Ganyu together would help fund each other's ultimates, and out of all cryo combinations, this duo would surely have the highest DPS ceiling. So if you've grown tired of her charge shots or you are planning to betray her for Yoimiya anyway, then this is one way you could still make great use of her without resorting to the bench. Now for the last slot. This is perhaps the most flexible of all and could be any element you may need at the moment, but in general you only want those that do not impair your freeze uptime. So either more Hydro, more Cryo, but ideally Anemo, because Anemo gives you access to 40% resistance shred, which is the best way to scale a Permafreeze team's damage, because you can't make use of any other elemental reactions anyway, and resistance shred acts as a separate multiplier that essentially amplifies all of your outgoing elemental damage. Since Geo shatters, it's generally not advised to use Geo with Ayaka, but Zhongli is Zhongli and universally great, so you can use him if you're using him only for the shield and resistance shred. But you do have to place your pillar out of reach so that it doesn't constantly shatter. If you're fine with that and you build him as a pure shield bot anyway, then Zhongli will work just fine. The same goes for Bennett, who's also generally great to have, and again he can totally work, because despite being a pyro unit, he actually doesn't apply that much pyro. But every now and then you will have to cast his E ability to get his ult back up, so there is that bit of anti-synergy with Freeze. And above that, I would say that Bennett doesn't do as much for a Permafreeze team as he does for others. Or in other words, Permafreeze is a team comp that can totally get away with not having 1000 or whatever more attack from Bennett, because you're already outsourcing all of your crit rate, so your artifacts and weapons can actually have some decent attack percent stats without you having to feel bad about them. So Bennett is probably just more impactful in other teams where that is not the case. If you happen to need Pyro to break a shield, he is a great pick, otherwise I'd say stick to Anemo. And with that, let's finally discuss our Anemo support options. Anemo Traveler is what you would use if you don't have any other Anemo character available. Their C6 allows for an additional 20% cryo resistance shred, which is nice, but their abilities are too disruptive in that their E knocks enemies back and their ultimate carries them away unless you're facing a wall, so their CC is pretty bad and they don't offer any other buffs or healing either. Sucrose is better in that regard since both of her abilities have a suction effect, but she still knocks enemies up, which can cause a DPS loss for characters that cannot hit airborne targets, and that includes Ayaka, at the very least her normal and charge attacks. and her ability to share a portion of her elemental mastery with other team members is sadly completely useless in Permafreeze because the freeze reaction itself doesn't deal any damage. So if you want to use Sucrose, you may consider scrapping the idea of elemental mastery on her altogether and build her more as a sub DPS with good ability damage, potentially even with a Thrilling Tales catalyst to act as an attack buffer, while still applying the 4-piece VV resistance shred. If you have her at C6, she grants a 20% elemental damage bonus to party members whose element is infused in her ultimate. This could be either Cryo for more Ayaka damage, or Hydro for more Xingqiu or Mona damage. Keep in mind that infusing Hydro may actually be better here, since that would help with additional Hydro application. Venti's ultimate also lifts enemies out of melee range, which can be annoying at times, but Ayaka's ultimate will still most likely hit everything inside the storm, and Venti still has the best CC of all Anemo characters. Jean can also work if you still need a healer, because she can consolidate resistance shred and healing in one, but the CC she offers isn't all that valuable for Ayaka because again she knocks enemies back rather than pulling them together. One thing to note though is that once enemies are frozen, they're no longer knocked up or pushed around, so that's one way you could counteract knockups from Venti and Sucrose, but you have to freeze them before casting those abilities, which may not always be possible. Then we have Kazuha. I already talked about his kit in another video, but to make it short, I think he is going to be the best Anemo support for Ayaka, as well as Xingqiu and also other melee carries, because he's great at grouping up enemies without knocking them back or up, and he can boost elemental damage for your entire team just by swirling the elements you want to boost, instead of having to rely on an infusion with his ultimate, as is the case with Sucrose, for example. This means that you can infuse Hydro in his ultimate, which helps with Hydro application, while still boosting both Hydro and Cryo damage in an Ayaka team, or Hydro and Electro in an Electrocharge team. Last but not least, I'm going to mention Sayu. If we oversimplify it here, she's going to be the 4-star alternative to Jean, in that she too combines Anemo with healing. As the only Anemo Claymore user, in theory she could also wear Wolf's Gravestone, which would allow her to shred resistances, heal, and buff the attack of party members at the same time. From the looks of it, she doesn't seem to have any noteworthy forms of CC or other inbuilt party buffs, but again, if you still need a healer, then she's much more accessible than Jean. And that already concludes this little discussion of pretty much every option you have to fill an Ayaka Permafreeze team. At the end of the day, of course, go for what you enjoy playing. Personally, I'm going to run one budget version with Ayaka as the only 5-star unit, and then Xingqiu, Sucrose, and Diona for the rest of the team, and then a slightly more invested version with Kazuha instead of Sucrose. I'll be showcasing both, as well as a Xingqiu Electrocharged team with Kazuha as soon as he's out, so if you're interested in that, stay tuned, and let me know which team composition you're planning to go for with your Ayaka, and why. And with all that said, thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.